All right, I think we're close. We are we're a little pressed for time. If other people come in, they'll come in. But let's get started so we can have a shot at getting through our Romans 5 lesson today. So, one of the things that I hope you notice in your book, and in order to help you notice it, I keep coming back to using some of these questions. But you'll notice there's in the first, there is I've read a chapter in Romans. What do I think about that chapter? And this is not a question this is really one for every week. It's really one for every chapter. And so there are 5 of those questions. We obviously don't deal with them all the time, but they're useful for you to think about, just to get your mind kind of around what you've just read and looking at that. And so today, I want us to start off with this question that was, what in this passage would change the lives of the Roman believers that was addressed? How would it make them, how would it make me a better disciple? So think about Romans 5. What did you read in Romans 5 that you go, wow, this is life-changing?
Well, after this message so far of you failed, you've done all these things wrong, and you're just not worthy, you can't do anything about it. Here it's, now you have been justified.
Yeah.
This is the good news. This is where you finally get that deep breath of, oh, good, safe.
I mean, it really, we talked about Wednesday night how it felt like it made a change. We said that if we have faith like Abraham, then we can be justified. That sounds good. And now he's even building on top of that, isn't he, in this way? So it's almost like, okay, wow, maybe there is hope for me. Maybe I can make it. So what else did you have here? Michelle?
I mean, so much intertwined conversation here, but verse 17, for if by the transgression of the one death reigned through the one, much more those who receive the abundance of grace and the gift of righteousness will reign in life through the one, Jesus Christ.
Wow, abundance of grace. Boy, that kind of fits with our theme here this year that we're just finishing up, right? But just think about that. I mean, how full was this board of all the things, the sinful things that people had done? I mean, it was just hammered with just, didn't matter if you were Jew, you broke the law. It didn't matter if you were Gentile, you didn't even have God half the time, and you didn't keep the law you knew. And now we're talking about there's an abundance of grace available. Wow, what a change. What a change, Eric.
How about an abundance of blessings? Even in times of confusion or
Absolutely.
hardship.
Absolutely. Great. Taylor?
In verse 3 and 4, where it talks about we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing suffering produces endurance, endurance produces character, character produces hope. The idea that we will still suffer throughout life, but also that's part of it, right? And we have the resources to cope with that, and that helps produce our character and hopefully build our belief, our faith.
Excellent. Good news. Well, all of that is really good. When you actually, when you had a chance to read Mark Roberts' chapter on this, he kind of gives us this way to think about it, which I think is very interesting. And it's the change in the news was so good in chapter 4 that from it's terrible and all have sinned all the way to you can be justified. And it's almost as if Paul goes, now I know what you're thinking. This is too good to be true. Is this too good to be true? This, really? Because how did Paul paint the picture of how bad it is to be in front of God with sin? What are some of the words he used? Remember chapter 2, verse 5? As sinners, what were we doing before God? Storing up wrath. Okay, so who wants to stand in front of the wrath of God? From all the examples we've seen in the Old Testament, what it was like to stand in front of the wrath of God, how great of a place is that to be? Standing in front of God's wrath. I don't want to be standing there. I mean, to be at war with God, what's the outcome going to be? You're going to lose. Okay. So that's where we were when you look at that. And now let's look at verses 1 through 2. What do we have now, according to Paul, in verses 1 through 2?
Peace.
We have peace. We're not at war with God anymore. We're at peace.
Justified.
We're justified. He has declared we're at peace. You're fine now. You're
Nothing we did,
justified.
but God did.
God did all that. We talked about that. But you are now at peace with God. And because you're at peace with God, what do you have? Verse 2 of chapter 5. You've got hope. And what does that hope, what emotion does that put into us, Eric? You were going to say we have hope, that's right. But when you know you've got hope versus I was at war with God and I was actually having to stand against the wrath of God. Now
I have a chance. I don't know.
I've got a chance. And so what does that make you do?
Rejoice.
Right. You rejoice. You rejoice in hope. And so what a chapter this is. We're going to talk about how this chapter is going to talk about how that look at how far you've come, Jews and Gentiles in Rome, Christians in Phoenix. Look at from what you've come to where you are. Your response to that is you got hope. And you should be happy about that hope. You should be rejoicing in that hope. And that's really what this lesson is about and what the intro is about. So I want to build on something that Taylor brought out here. There is occasionally in the scripture you get this kind of an analysis of one thing leads to another, one thing builds on another. We talk about Christian gifts, we see that. There's one of those here in this passage that I want us to stop and make sure that we notice. And that is in verses 3 through 5. Hope and joy is built on something, and you're going to have to kind of work it backwards because I want us to work this one backwards. So what is it that produces this hope that we have, or joy, according to what these verses say? What produces hope? Character. Character produces hope. What is character?
Who we really are.
Okay, who we really are, who we really are. Well, who we really are, according to Romans, is pretty bad, right? Up until this point. So, what kind of character are we talking about here? Are we talking about who we really are, or what's this character mean here? The character to do what? To be what? So if we have hope that we can have peace with God and we have joy because of that, because we now have character. What kind of character would this be?
My Bible says tempered steel of virtue.
Virtuous character, godly character. I think that's what's implied here, is that we have good character. We are now the people that God wants us to be. We're the people that God looks at and says, I don't have a problem now with them. Their sins are covered, and they're now doing something. In fact, the faith of people that have character would be like the faith of who that we just studied Wednesday night? Abraham. Abraham had character. How do we know Abraham had character? What did Abraham do because of his faith? He trusted God explicitly. Doing that. Okay, so how do we get character?
Perseverance.
Challenges. Perseverance.
Endurance.
Right, so we have endurance or perseverance.
Paul mentioned suffering.
Patience.
That's a hard one.
So, how do we, from whence do we get endurance? You just said it. Wow. Okay, now this got real, right? These are all just nice concepts here, but Paul introduced us to this foundational building principle that suffering produces endurance, which produces character, which allows us to have hope and joy. Now let me ask you, the last time you suffered, how'd you feel about that?
Joyful in the end.
Did you feel that in the beginning?
No.
No.
It's a process.
Mitch, how many times, and Austin, how many times do we as elders know of someone who's down and they're down on themselves and they can't see past the down things that are here, that there is some purpose to it. It's like, why, how many times have we heard, why is God doing this to me? Why won't he get me out of these things?
But if you count your blessings, then the suffering is put kind of in the background, no matter how bad it is, because you have way more blessings than you do suffering.
That is true when you go beyond it. But somehow, how do we become convinced that this is not a part of our life as a Christian?
Keep on moving forward.
There's this sense of, Paul, God, no one ever promised us that we weren't going to have suffering. In fact, he gave us a way to contextualize these sufferings. These sufferings are the things, if you endure them appropriately, and again, with who? With the faith like Abraham showed, with the faith that totally trusts God, despite all the things that are happening, that in the end, it's going to build your character, and because of that, you have hope and joy in doing that. And let me tell you, that's a hard thing to do. It's almost too good to be true, isn't it? That I can suffer, and because of that, I'm going to have more character, and I'm going to have more hope and more joy.
And it's important to remember that, like, it's still called suffering, right? So we still are going to feel that pain or that frustration or whatever it might be. But I think the longer you are a Christian, the more you suffer, unfortunately, the more you do suffer, the more you can be like, okay, I know that I'm hurting right now, or I'm frustrated, or whatever that suffering might be. But you start to lean more and more on God because you realize there is a bigger picture. I personally don't like this is how I'm having to go through it, but I trust you, God, that there is a better ending than maybe what I'm seeing right now. And I think for me personally, at least, that's allowed me to not be so anxious, not be so stuck in like what I can't control necessarily. So that's how I've kind of used it in my own life.
Now let's think about these Christians. They're in Rome. What's going to happen to these Christians in a few years?
Persecuted.
They're going to be persecuted severely. Like we can't even imagine in our culture and our society right now how they are. And whatever suffering they're having now, what was that actually building them toward? To be able to stand up to that. Have you ever thought, what I'm going through now is building me toward being able to deal with something bigger? Versus, woe is me. And listen, I can do woe is me all day long. But these people were being built towards something, if we're looking at that. And when we learn how that this suffering produces hope, and he goes on, by the way, in those verses to say, what does hope not produce? It does not produce shame. We are never going to be ashamed of the hope that we have in God. Hope does not produce that. But if you're ashamed of being a Christian in Rome, and you back off from being a Christian, did your suffering turn out for anything? Not if you backed away from it. And so, interesting building here, recognizing that to have this hope and joy, we have to have this character in this suffering. Now let me give you, we're going to jump into the rest of these verses, and lesson went a little long this morning. We've got a little bit of wiggle room in the schedule, so if we don't get finished with 5, we'll get 6, and Mitch will let me take part of his lesson 7 for going there ahead if we have to split up. So I want us to really stop and talk about this. He has 2 weeks on chapter 7, so we'll figure it out behind the scenes. In verses 6 through 9, have you read these verses before? Are you very familiar with them? Romans chapter 5, verses 6 through 9. While we were weak, how many times have you heard that read before the Lord's Supper? Right? Okay? I want you to put your logical thinking cap on. This is Greg in his native mode. I'm a logical kind of computer programmer kind of guy. From those first three words, while we were still weak at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. What does that imply about today? Christ died while we were still weak, so what are we not anymore?
We're not weak.
We're not weak. So this hope does not produce shame and joy. What does this hope? This produces strength. And it's kind of interesting that Paul uses that language in setting up and showing us this beautiful picture of what Jesus did. But one of his points is, when you have this hope that is produced by living with this kind of faith, you get stronger. And guess what that strength allows you to do? You can deal with more. You can make it through more without worrying about being shaken. And that's why when we talk about this chapter, and Mark talks about this a lot, I almost thought about we should just sing the song Blessed Assurance. This chapter is about being assured that what we're doing is the right thing, and it's going to turn out in the end to be the best possible thing it can for us. And how many times does doubt enter into your life? Does it ever show up, rear its ugly head? Am I really doing what's right? Is this really worth it? This is the chapter to go to when you actually think about, can I be assured that hanging on, even though I'm suffering for my faith, is the right thing? Enduring something in this world with grace and according to God's word is a whole lot better than what Job's wife asked him to do. Why don't you just curse God and die? The world's going to tell us that about our faith. And yet, if we actually understand that this is actually a mechanism that God assures us, not only can we handle whatever gets thrown at us in this world, but He assures us of what's on the other side. And that's really what this chapter is about. So, I want to talk a little bit about the questions now, and we'll use that to really bring everything else. But I just thought in that intro, this was something that to me hit me just kind of between the eyes, that if I want to be strong for God, I have to trust Him even when it's hard to trust Him, because that's the faith that Abraham had, and that's the faith that leads us to justification, that causes us to be justified, and that's the outcome. Mitch.
You know, our lives are compared in the New Testament to gold and silver. Gold and silver becomes pure when it's the dross, it's burnt off.
Mm-hmm.
And
Which takes fire, right?
Which takes a lot of fire and a lot of heat, but what comes out the other side is pure. And that our lives are like that. We've got to have our impurities burnt off, and sometimes that's very painful.
It is. This first question, I don't know if it came in your book, if it came at you out of nowhere, but remember, we're talking about assurance in our salvation. And so, what are the two different ways that we could talk about in feeling assurance of salvation? We just talked about one, right? We're assured because of what God has done, right? So we have assurance for that. What is the other way that people seek assurance? Self-assurance. So what does self-assurance look like? Most people wouldn't say I'm seeking self-assurance. Let's talk about what it looks like. What do people who are seeking self-assurance do?
Compare incorrectly.
So they compare.
Contrast.
I've done more, right?
Or I've done less.
Or less, depending if you have less assurance. Less assurance. Both of those are true, absolutely. What other things?
contrast, at least I'm not as bad as they are.
That's kind of what I meant by that, yeah.
Yeah, we can do both of those things, right? Absolutely. What did the Jews try to do?
Perfection, trying to keep them, like, doing everything correctly with the law.
Law keeping. So what, you know, what did I do? Did I do it all? It's like,
Kind of checking boxes.
yeah. And so there's kind of that law keeping box check. But maybe those who aren't as familiar with law, you still see people doing a similar thing. You ever heard someone say, well, at least the good I've done outweighs the bad I've done.
Right.
Right? So there's that good deeds.
What about the feeling that you can do it on your own?
Okay? I can do this. That's exactly right. And there's even this sense that my faith is strong, right? You ever try to assess yourself by going, well, my faith is strong. I've got strong faith, so I must be okay, you know. Maybe I'm trying to compare it with Abraham, but I don't know. So let's talk about this. When I'm using any of those methods of self-assurance, where does the doubt creep in as to am I really right with God? What's the source of the doubt for these methods?
Bad things you've done.
Yeah, it's like, have I done enough? Right? I've done a lot. I wonder if I've done enough.
You don't know where that line is, that threshold
Yeah.
of,
They've done more
Good
than I
enough.
Yeah, well, this person's done more than me. Are they ahead of me?
have. Yeah.
Where's God gonna draw that line in doing that? I can do this. What happens when we find something that we can't do? Ever found something that you can't do that you said you should be able to do, but
We go to, I can
It's easy
do
to
all
give up.
things through God who strengthens me.
that's where we should be. But if we're trying to if we're actually establishing how do I feel about am I really going to heaven?
When the doubt
Self-doubt.
creeps in, that's when you sometimes give up.
And if doubt actually is able to grow, then we do give up. Right? So when the devil threw suffering at the Romans, what was he trying to get them to do?
quit.
Give up. So when does doubt creep in? Oftentimes where doubt creeps in when we're having a hard time with something. But because that really makes us go back and assess what's happening here. When we base our assurance based on what God has done, where does the doubt creep in? What's that look like, by the way, to base our assurance on what God has done? Because that's really what the rest of this chapter is about.
Well, you know, one thing that, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Eric.
The word I thought was faith, I don't know if that's the right word.
Faith in who now?
Faith in the Lord,
Faith in God.
faith in the good word.
I'm not able to get this done.
with
Because you know who is? God is. Mitch and then.
No, I was gonna say, if you look at that side, it's subjective. It's all subjective. It's based on how I feel versus objective in what God has done and what He's revealed. That's where the confidence comes from, not so much over here a lot of times.
Carol?
This is the first chapter that we see grace mentioned. Grace in which we stand. Without grace,
And do we stand in our own grace? Whose grace is that?
God's grace.
God's the one who showed us grace. He says we can. So how shaky is God's grace, the ground to stand on?
Not.
Not at all. Now, let's use question 2 to actually talk about the basic way he establishes this, and then we'll probably run out of time here. Somewhere at the end of that, we'll talk about Adam and Jesus next week or next Wednesday night, Christmas night. That'll be our Christmas lesson. We're aiming to understand what has God done and how can it make sure that the doubt gets taken out of our life. And so this is a case, if you didn't read your commentary, you might not have been familiar with this phrase he uses here. But Mark talks about that Paul uses a mechanism that was common in the day, one that actually Jesus used, that it was called the heavy to light mechanism. And so those of you who were able to read the commentary, tell me what is the general thing we're looking for when we're looking at one of these arguments where someone's talking about heavy to light. What are we looking for? Michelle?
If the really difficult thing can be done, or the heavy thing, then how much easier is it to do the light thing or the easier thing?
Okay,
That's what Mark said. That was new to me.
okay. So it's one of these things that, well, if God can, well, let's just say, if you can do this, you certainly can do this. This is acknowledged, this is hard. So if we can prove that somebody can do something hard, then doing something easy is no problem. And that's it. Okay, now let's talk about the heavy to light argument in verses 6 through 9. What is the heavy thing that God did? Okay. He sent his son. He sent his son to die.
For ungodly people.
For ungodly people. Another word is used about those people as well. What's the other word?
Enemies.
His enemies. He was at war with us. He was storing up wrath for us. That was what we deserved. He sent his son to die for ungodly people. So he did it at the right time. If you look at the phrases in those verses, he did it. He showed his love for us. He died for us.
We were no use to him whatsoever. He still
So
did.
we went from being of no use to, he uses that other word that we used a lot in chapter 3,
Justified.
justified. See, we went from being no use, we went from being condemned
Good for nothing. Good for something.
to being declared right, be accounted right, as we talked about in chapter 4. Okay. If God was able to do this, how hard is it for him to get one of his children across the finish line that trust him? Because he did this for us. We were not only enemies, we were weak. What's he doing for us now to help us get across the finish line? Where's our weakness going? He's building us towards strength, right? If God could have done that, if he went so far in his love for us, I don't know how this happened in heaven. I imagine scenes. Can you imagine God and Jesus sitting down, God going, I've got an idea.
He's our biggest cheering section.
Here's how we can bring them back. All it really takes is like 33 years in their time. Was that all that it took? I mean, we can't even fathom what it was like for Jesus to leave where he. Other passages would talk about this. It was difficult for God. It was difficult for Jesus. The words in this Bible could never tell us how difficult it was. And yet he did that. And we're going to sit here and doubt that he can get us across the finish line?
And let's roll this out over the next several thousand years,
Yeah.
this plan that we came
Yeah.
up with.
Let's kind of give it in pieces and all.
We can handle that.
And so if God did, what's the easy thing is getting me to heaven. If I have faith, and if I have trust, which is the only thing that brings me to the table here, I trust what you say, I have faith in what you say, and I'm gonna trust you, then he can get me there. He can get me there. And that's not
Obedience.
miraculous, it's just he can do it, so.
Obedience has to come in there too. We can't just blithely say, well, you know, here, I do as I please, and God's gonna get me there because of what he's already
Well,
done.
now you're already into chapter 6, but yes, you are correct.
Getting ahead of
You are
myself.
correct. But that obedience is the same kind of obedience that Abraham showed. It was real faith. Obedience is really just take the coin of faith and turn it over. On the other side of it is obedience, but it's a certain kind of obedience, right? And that's exactly where we go here. And so that heavy to light argument is, I mean, just think about verse 10. While we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his Son. If that's true, and it is, what's the next half of that verse say? So much more, now that we're reconciled, we'll be saved by his life. So the reconciliation happened, it's an event that happened. It's a justification. And we all know that's baptism. And again, chapter 6 is going to talk about that some more, being baptism. But he's saying, this happened, you were reconciled. If he could do that and declare you not a sinner, he can certainly save you by your own merits. Is that what he said? How's he going to save us?
By grace.
It's by grace. What's he say in the verse?
Saved by his life.
By his.
By his life, by Jesus' life.
This is like-
Oh, now we have a bridge that we're going to a new place here. How does Jesus' life help save us once we've been reconciled? What is Jesus' life for us?
An example.
It's an example. I think it's another way of saying
Yeah.
Christian living, right? You'll be saved if you live in accordance with Jesus' life. And so now all of a sudden we've got the door open for a whole lot of the rest of Romans that we're going to get to in the last half of it is, what should you people in Rome who are arguing with each other and divided really be doing? And what effect should this message have on you? It shouldn't be doing what you're doing, arguing with each other. It should be getting on with your life in Christ. And your life in Christ doesn't look like this. It looks totally different than that. But guess what? God can get you there too. If you're not there on your own, what's happening? God's sending you on a message. You need to get there. And Paul is actually doing that here. And so, to me, this is just a wonderful section here that bridges through all of that.
If they had, the Roman Christians, if they had the love that Paul's gonna try to teach them all through the book, then all this other would take care of itself. You know, if I love you, I'm gonna want to get along with you. I wasn't gonna want to be friends.
And it's kind of interesting, and I'm going to jump into one of the later questions because we're going to come back and we'll talk briefly on Wednesday night to start off with about this point he makes about Adam and Jesus. Because in case the resurrection, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus and what he said in verses 6 through 9 didn't convince us, this whole thing about Adam is really meant to convince us that, you know, God can make this happen. Let me just tell you how big. It's almost like this is how big of a deal it was for Jesus to come. So we're going to put that aside and talk about that now. But if you think about those Roman Christians, if the Roman and the Jewish, if the Gentile and the Jewish and the Greek and the barbarian and the slaves and the non-slaves that were all together in the church in Rome, if they sat down and thought about, this is what God did for me, what's the last thing on their mind?
Fussing with each other.
Bickering with each other. If a group of people collectively realizes what God did for them, what's that group of people going to collectively do if they're living by faith?
Fine.
They're going to rejoice in hope. Can you believe that God has done this? Where you came from, where I came from, who cares? Look at what God has done for us.
Makes you wanna do your part,
Do my part.
follow through.
I think I need to tell somebody else about this. They need to understand this. And that focal point that it brings us when we realize just how much God has done for us, it takes, well, number one, it takes the focal point off ourselves. And sometimes focusing on ourselves is almost always the source of division. Because I figure out a reason that me and you aren't on the same page if I'm focusing on myself, versus going, wow, what can I learn from Arlene's years of experience? Looking from here, where can I, all of those things, you know, what can I as a Gentile learn from these Jews about, I thought this was a big deal. Man, given what God's forgiven them of, it's even more amazing. All of those kind of things that should bind us together don't if we focus on ourselves. And so, how do we know when we have assurance of God's plan? If we have this joy and hope, we can't keep this out of our lives if we're assured. And if we don't have the joy and hope, it's an indication that I'm really not assured of my salvation. Why? What's getting in the way? Am I somehow thinking that the tough things I'm going through are too tough for God? Am I getting impatient with God? Am I like Abraham, 23, 24 years from God making the first promise till he actually saw that the first step in that promise is going? All of those kind of things are indicators to me of, hey, I need to reorient my thinking here and recognize I don't like this suffering, but God can get me through it. Whether it's physical suffering or spiritual suffering, the suffering because of someone I love that is not doing what they should. You name the reasons that we have that. Mitch?
Just real quick, I think in the margins of our Bible, everyone needs to write Luke chapter 7. Luke chapter 7, remember when Jesus was having dinner with Simon, we don't have any trouble forgiving others once we realize how much Jesus has forgiven us. I mean, that's Romans chapter 5 in a real thumbnail kind of thing.
It absolutely is. I mean, it is when we truly know how much we're forgiven of, and we recognize exactly what it took to forgive me. I'm just going to figure out how to not hold grudges. I'm going to figure out how to get together with people instead of push myself apart. And that's.
That could almost break you down, thinking of all the things he's given you grace for, and then you're holding a grudge against someone because they cut you off on the highway.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Think of where you've been your whole life, and look what he did for you. Let it go.
Exactly it. So we took a little longer there than I had originally planned, but it really felt like a good conversation for us. So we'll start there. We'll kind of compact but I want you, when you read that section about there, this is a section where all these things that are called Calvinism drop in. And when you read this section, I want you to not worry about that, like Mark says. And we can talk about any questions you have about that at the end. But when you read this section, read it for the reason Paul wrote it. What Jesus did is so big, he undid the worst sin that's ever been committed. And that's really what this section is about when comparing it to Adam. Adam did the worst thing that has ever been done on the face of the earth if you're ranking sins. And he talks a little bit about why, even though we don't rank sins. If you do, you can't name a bigger one than Adam. And then Jesus undid all of that. So think about that for